Okay, so good evening, everyone. Boa noite. Welcome back to our series, Brazil, 200 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. Uh, this series is presented by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. And today's topic, since it's the week after independence, is Brazil in the aftermath of independence. We changed to keep the same. And presenting tonight is Dr. Elaine Rocha from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. She presented here before, so she is an historian. And I will give over to her. Let's hear what she has to say. Okay,
Good evening, everybody. Good evening to all that are reunited here. And to those who will be watching later, thank you for coming by. It is a pleasure to be here again. We are going to pick up from where we left last time and try my best to summarize about 100 years of history with you guys. I am at the university, so I will apologize for any noise that I cannot control, which is around me. I will start my sharing right now. 1 minute. So many windows open. Here it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, you can see your presentation. All is fine.
Can see the slides? Yes. So we are celebrating 200 years of independence of Brazil this month. Actually, it was 1 week ago. And what has changed in Brazil since it became independent? That is the major question that we want to ask for this period. And I don't know, it's like impossible. Just because I start to talk, noise, two trucks. Sorry, I'm going to stop a little bit because two trucks is impossible. I have no idea why. Sorry about the noise. It's like the garbage.
It may be noisy for you, but we can hear you perfectly.
It's not. Oh, okay. So I will continue then. Well, no, the week before when I spoke, I explained that Brazil stopped being a colony in 1808 when the royal family moved to Brazil, trying to avoid being captured by Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. So that changed the status of Brazil, and Brazil from 1808 would have the same status as Portugal because the royal family was here. In 1821, the king of Portugal was under pressure to go back to Portugal, and he goes back and leaves his son Pedro, which is this young guy on the side. This is the King João. This is João VI, sorry, I put here fourth, but it's fourth from, it's sexto, six. So Pedro is advised to keep Brazil in the family. So Brazil soon is going to separate from Portugal. The time is coming. Be alert because they are seeing what is happening in all the other former colonies of Spain that are becoming independent. This is 1821. And so when the occasion rises, take the crown and put in your own head before an opportunist does it. It was very important for them to keep Brazil with some ties with Portugal. at that moment. And that is exactly what Pedro does in 1822, when he was being pressured to also go back to Portugal. And there would be a consequence. If nobody from the royal family lived in Brazil, Brazil would go back to the status of a colony. And that was not possible anymore in the mind of Brazilians, because at that point Brazil had developed too many, a big structure, so many political developments, so many things has changed that they didn't want to go back to the status of being dependent, to be a colony. So in 1822, Pedro from Portugal, the son of the King of Portugal, proclaims the independence of Brazil, and that was 7th of September. What changed at that moment? Well, Brazil becomes independent, but it does not become a republic. It continues to be a monarchy. It's going to be self-declared an empire. It's going to maintain absolutism. It had a constitution, but the constitution doesn't change the structure. It maintains, for example, it maintains slavery. It honors the ties with Portugal, some financial ties with Portugal, and even signs with England. In exchange for the recognition of Brazil as an independent nation, Brazil agrees in paying the Portuguese debts to England. So Brazil starts his life as an independent country with a huge bill to pay. The agrarian elite maintained the power, because at that moment we have an agrarian elite that was born in Brazil. And we have middle class born in Brazil. You all, those who saw my presentation, in the previous 300 years, because Brazil started being colonized in 1500, 300 years, Brazil developed a lot. And there is a kind of elite, but also a middle class. The Portuguese advisors continue to be close to the emperor, this first emperor, Pedro the First. And the Brazilian elite were kind of discontent with that. They want to rise on power. So they still seeing some people from Portugal having too much power. And the right to vote were limited. At that point, to vote, you have to prove that you own certain amounts of land. So that would exclude too many people. And so there were certain things on the Constitution that was not very interesting. On the other side, the society kept being the same. You have the elite, the aristocrat, the ones who own plantations. You have the free men. It could be Portuguese, it could be free men of color, doesn't matter. They had, some would have business, small business. Some would be like merchants. But there are some classes of free men, which is minimal at this point. And the big point is a big number, a very large number of slaves that are in this society. And that did not change. So Brazil is independent, but it stains the slavery. In 1822, slave trade was abolished already in big part of the world, and Britain is policing the Atlantic Ocean and capturing the slave ship. However, Brazil continued to trade mainly through the Portuguese colonies, where you already have Brazilian slave merchants, people that trade slaves, but they are Brazilian, but now they live in those ports of Africa, and they trade with Africans, bring together to those ports, and from there they export to Brazil. Most of them were in the area that is Angola. but there were some in Mozambique and in Kenya. So we have some trading coming from the Indian coast of Africa and crossing through South Africa and coming to Rio de Janeiro. So in this 19th century, the slaves are going to arrive mostly in Rio de Janeiro. This is a representation of the slave market. This is where they look. This is in Rio, where they put the slaves together, and then they are going to bring them to, put some weight, be clean, to get a better price. Some were traded in the streets. These are some images of this type of slaves that came to Brazil. They tried to create some classifications. They are not very different, but people were mixed. In general, you have a society where you have, at the same time, slaves coming from Africa, but you have more than one generation of slaves born in Brazil, and you even have slaves that were mixed with Indians, indigenous people, and white people, still slaves. The Brazilian economy in the 19th century still, the major thing was the plantation economy. It was the production of sugarcane, coffee. From 1850 especially, is going to be coffee, mostly. The most important product is going to be coffee, and we have also cotton plantation. But of course, we also have the mines, the gold and silver and stones and diamonds in Brazil. So the economy is kind of a little bit diverse for a colony. So when his father had to go in 1831, he's demanded to go back to Portugal because there is a problem in Portugal. His brother, because his father died, and his brother was the tutor of Pedro's daughter. His daughter was to be the queen of Portugal because Pedro, was he abdicated from the crown in Portugal, the crown would go to his first child, which is a girl. And his brother, who was supposed to be the tutor, was nominated the tutor to the girl, decided to marry her. It was not enough that he was going to marry his niece, but his niece was 9 years old. When the news arrived in Brazil that this is going to happen, you can imagine, as any father, he packed and left to defeat his brother, Miguel. And by leaving, he left with the entire family. He left his son, male son in Brazil, which is also called Pedro, who at the time was 5 years old and was left under the care of certain people, very important people, intellectuals, who are going to be very influential in the Second Empire, because that's going to begin the Second Empire of Brazil. So what can you do when your emperor or your king is 5 years old? They would nominate like an assembly of regents, and those would be in between the two political parties, the liberals and conservatives. Whoever have more votes is going to be the regent, and they are going to try to govern Brazil. At that point, Brazil had lots of rebellions and riots and even wars. The society needed a stronger government. So the same problems that were being faced in other parts of the Americas, where former colonies were breaking down into pieces, forming different countries, was the risk of happening in Brazil. A few of the wars that happened during this period between 1824 and 1850. We have this 1824, we have a revolution that was between the countries, the states that produce sugar cane, mainly the area of Ecuador. So the Ecuador line, not Ecuador country, Ecuador line. And that was against absolutism because they wanted more power. They wanted something more like the United States, like a federation, and not this type of centralized government that they have under Pedro I. That one, they fought, that's okay. In 1831, right before Pedro go back to Portugal, there was another war. This was in the south. It was a war for Uruguay because Brazil invaded Uruguay and claimed Uruguay as part of the territory of Brazil because the father of Pedro, John, or João, was married to a lady who was Spanish, and she was from the, so she received Uruguay as her dowry from the crown of Spain, her father. And João said that he owned the dowry of his wife, and he decided that Uruguay was his own. And the Uruguayans claim it different, that they were from Spain. And when they decide to become independent, Brazil said, no, we are going to, the point this is Pedro in Brazil, we are going to take over. There is a war. England entered the war on the side of Uruguay. There was a negotiation. Yeah, Brazil lost the negotiation, got a little bit of land, but Uruguay is a free country in 1831, independent country. In 1835 to 1840, 5 years of war. The Cabanage War is in the area of Amazon, closer to the Atlantic side. So this is a long-term war. It took lots of energy. Some people claim there were lots of influence from what happened in other countries, even Haiti. There were different ideas in the war. During these 5 years, leadership changed. And there were indigenous people involved, black people involved, free blacks, enslaved blacks, they run away and engaged in the war. So it was a big confusion. But in 1840, they managed to control the area. There was a Sabinada War between 1837 and 38. All these wars was lost cause. So they want to separate, but Brazil continued to be one territory. You have the Balayos War between 1838 and 1840. So you see, it's a sequence of wars, and even sometimes more than one war like happening at the same time. One of these wars that is very important is the revolt of the Malays, which is a large revolt of African slaves, but they were very different. I'm going to talk next. Between 1835 and 1845 was the Farrapos War, where the state where Marco comes from, Rio Grande do Sul, decided that they also want their own way or separation from Brazil. There was also another long war. But I'm going to speak more about the Malay because the Malay revolt has a large impact. It's a major revolt of slaves. And they have a very important characteristic because they were Muslims. They are all Muslims. They are all in the urban environment, and they were proposed to end Catholicism. They evoked, they called a jihad, a holy war against the Catholics. And so part of their plan was to murder and confiscate all the goods from all whites and mestizos, and to establish an Islamic monarchy in Brazil. They are going to elect their general as the king. And it was also defending the enslavement or the murder of non-Islamic. It didn't last long, and 70 rebellion slaves died and 7 soldiers. There were also 200 prisoners, men and women as well, participate. And many of those were tried and sentenced to various penalties like flogging, some to the galleys, some were also sentenced to death, some were sent back to Africa, some sent to prison in Rio de Janeiro. The revolt of the Malis changed and was very scary because they could organize themselves, sending messages, writing in Arabic. It was the first time they had a revolt so well organized. So when this was happening, this is 1835, by 1840, the liberals decided that the emperor should be declared not a minor anymore, should be declared responsible, and he would be crowned the emperor because he's at the very mature age of 14 years old. They decided to abolish the regents, all the people who took care of him. He had finished his studies. He was homeschooled, as was fashionable that time. And they decided to even marry him, to make him even more responsible. And he becomes the second emperor of Brazil. Some things in the economy at that point is already changing. By 1840s, so Brazil is so big. In some parts of Brazil, you are having these revolutions and wars. In other parts of Brazil, and this is Rio de Janeiro, Irineu Evangelista de Souza, Barão de Mauá. He was the pioneer of industrialization in Brazil with the construction of railroad, first experiments with hydroelectricity, first experiments with the telegraph, developing a metal industry that we already had, but he is now expanding a textile industry and banking. We had the Bank of Brazil, but Mauá now is creating a new bank, a private bank. And it was working, was very good for the economy. There were also some changes on slavery, and those changes was mostly because the revolt of the Malay showed that we could not keep slavery for so long. So certain things had to change. One thing that was changing was a law in 1850 under the pressure of the British Empire. Brazil signed a law, finally, forbidding the trading of African slaves. The law was signed, but it was not enforced right away. See, the trading with Africa, of slaves with Africa, extended all the way to 1857. Lots of problems because of that. In 1871, Brazil signed the Free Womb Law. So all children born from 1871 was considered free, but they have to stay in the care, under the care of their masters, because you cannot put a child in the streets. They were supposed to be working until they become an adult. So they have to give free work. After that, they become free. So that was the idea. In 1885, they made another law. This is all in trying to extend, give a little bit, compromise a little bit, but keep slavery. In 1885, they signed that all slaves over 60 years old would be free. That law was not good because a 60-year-old slave usually is very sick and old, and it would have some physical issues. And that created situation in which elder Black people were abandoned. So it created a more problem than a solution. And in 1888, finally comes the abolition. Abolition in Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in the continent, to the point that we already had photograph. The photography was developed. So these are photos actually taken from slaves. This is a master with his slaves. He went there, he wanted to be photographed with his slaves. And these are some slaves. We have some people, some photographers that went to places and took photos of slaves. There are many photos of slaves in Brazil. Another thing that happened before the abolition and during the Second Empire was the Paraguayan War. This is the map here. So Paraguay is here. And Paraguay don't have a way to the ocean, and that affects the economic development. So they were trying to use the river and go using the Paraná River all the way to the Plata Basin and get out between Uruguay and Argentina. It didn't work, and they are trying to get a little space from Brazil to reach the ocean. And Brazil took that as an invasion of territory, which was, and declared war to Paraguay. Uruguay also entered the war, and Argentina also entered the war. So it was a war of they call the Triple Alliance, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina against Paraguay. 5 years of war. What happened during this war, because it was so extended, and the Paraguayans fought very well, Brazil did not have a large number of troops and had to increase the number of troops. And to do that, they had to enlist people of color. What I mean by people of color, I mean mulattoes and blacks, and we call Cafuzos, the indigenous people, mixed with blacks and mixed with white. They were all enlisted. As a result, they could have a better organized army and navy. How they enlisted those men of color to fight so far away, because this is the deep south of Brazil? Well, they promised our people who enlisted, the free men who enlisted, they promised they would get a pension after, which they did. And some states, many of the states, promised the married men enlisted that their children would have access to school. They're gonna have a place for their children on school. This was a major attractiveness. So they went to this war, and some slaves, they got their freedom as they enlisted as soldiers. So a owner of plantation called to enlist had the possibility of sending not only one, but more than one slaves, able slave, what they call an able slave, a young man, able to enlist in his name. And in the act of enlisting, they would receive freedom. That was very important. And after, if they survived the war, they would get a pension. And that was good enough for many people. Brazilians also, Brazilian forces were mainly black and brown. And these are, they call zouavos. And I know you have the zouavos here in Barbados. And this is 1865. Black soldiers are called zouavos. And their jacket, I know here is difficult to see, but their jacket is this deep blue, as your zouavo here. This is the photo of a soldier going to Paraguay. This is a representation of a soldier. These two soldiers here are Brazilian soldiers, so different platoons, different uniforms. But the fact is that black soldiers were all over. So there's a black soldier from Paraguay, a black soldier from Brazil, a black soldier from Uruguay, and a black soldier from Argentina. Brazil, however, has the largest number of black troops. This created a situation in which you have the urban environments, especially close to the coast, because those soldiers would travel to south by sea. So one of the cities that they are going to stop is Rio de Janeiro, and they are going to stay there for a while because it's there that they are going to receive military training. And when they come back, they also have to go to Rio de Janeiro to give their names and apply for pension and everything. So Rio de Janeiro, the black population in terms of free men in Rio de Janeiro is going to expand. And those who come to Rio de Janeiro, so at this point, you still have slaves, so you have lots of free blacks, but you have lots of enslaved blacks. And so in Rio de Janeiro, it starts to become more complicated to control who is free, who is slave, one help another. It's getting complicated, the situation in Rio de Janeiro. In order to keep the working force under control, since they knew that they were coming to the end of slavery, in 1850 they signed a law that declared that all land in Brazil that were not occupied was property of the state. And to own property, you had to, or you buy, or you have to have a proof that somebody donated to you, and you have to have written documents. So to squat in a piece of land was a risk, and many black people took that risk and lost, because after they planted, well, by the time of the crop, sometimes even the second or third crop, somebody with friends in the government got a paper signed saying that that land belonged to them. So they lose everything they had done, all the improvements, everything they have done to this, they had no rights. That was a way to keep the lower class people under the control, and they would then be forced to work for very low salaries. On the other hand, by 1870s, Brazil, knowing that it could not maintain slavery, there is no slave trade anymore, although internal trading continued until 1885, 1887, they still trading forced between the different states and then within the states. But in 1870, they started to increase their campaign for abolition, and on the other hand, they start to bring European immigrants to substitute slaves. Those workers from Europe came in large number. Brazil received millions of people from Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and other places also, like Russia, Germany, Poland, to the point that they were competing with free people of color for jobs. This is from 1872 and goes on until more or less 1930s, when the immigration, the entrance of foreigners in Brazil would decline. I didn't put here in the slide, but it was also from the 1850s a law forbidding the entrance of blacks in Brazil. So blacks could only enter Brazil if they were slaves. Once it was abolished the slave trade, black people could not enter as free immigrant worker in Brazil. It was forbidden. They would not receive a visa, and they would be captured and sent back to wherever they come from. So in 1889, slavery was abolished in Brazil. And there was a law signed by the daughter of the Dom Pedro II, the emperor, and that created an opposition. The elite that supported the monarchy at that moment decided that they don't support the monarchy anymore. It was bad for them. So they signed up with the Republicans, and in 1889, a military coup established a republic in Brazil. The monarch, Dom Pedro II, the second, was sent to Europe with his entire family, and now Brazil doesn't have any monarchy, is now a republican regime. A new constitution came, and there was some change. The idea of the land did not change, so certain things, there was not a structural change. Slavery was already abolished. They extended the right to vote to all people that could read and write. No racial discrimination. But of course, the majority of people that came out of slavery were illiterate. But laws to control the lower class population resulted in criminalization of people of color and loss of discrimination, difficult in finding housing because they cannot have property, they don't have money to buy property, so they become squatters in urban area. There was the situation of poverty, marginality, over-exploitation of their work. And at the same time, the elite maintained its status, and a new middle class of civil servants working for the Republican government, military people, because the military got, with more power at the end of the war against Paraguay, and now that the military is the ones that are commanding the government in the new republic, so they are very powerful. And you have also some business owners. What is the situation in post-abolition Brazil? You have a massive entrance of European immigrants. Look here, Marco, you're going to find your grandfather. And maybe Marilyn also.
I probably will not, because they arrived in 1835. So.
Just kidding. So these are immigrants from Spain as well. And this is a favela, which is like a squatting, and people looking for places at the river banks or at hills, places that were not very safe and were not very a place that people actually want to live. So a place that was just left aside to live there. And that is the origins of the favela. And they would find whatever work they could do for whatever money. This becomes the size of Brazil. So the last parts of Brazil, part of the territory, this part of the territory of Brazil, Brazil takes from the war against Paraguay. Some parts here also, it used to belong to Paraguay, but after the war, Brazil got this part. Here at this corner also, it was an agreement between Brazil and Bolivia, Brazil and Peru, another agreement, and Brazil took the shape. By the 20th century, Brazil had the shape that it has today. Economic development would rise, so you have the entire 20th century, Brazil would produce more energy, with sugarcane, with biomasses, and also we produce uranium, natural gas, and oil. So the economy is going to develop a lot, finding gas and oil in different parts of Brazil. The steel mill will also expand and produce and serve our industry, because we have the minerals and now we are transforming the minerals in steel. In the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, the industry was more modernized, Brazil started to produce cars, for example, but many other things, like in terms of cars, Brazil produced Volkswagen, Ford, Fiat, Honda, Renault, General Motors, Peugeot, Citroën, Mercedes-Benz, Chrysler. I don't know at this point what else, but I think it has expanded. Brazil also has industries that produce television, radio, and other electrodomestics. So appliances that you consume is produced in Brazil. Shoes is something that we are known for in the international arena. We produce and export. We produce and export textile, and also produce and export top models. Hydroelectricity, almost 80% of the energy generated by Brazil and to consume domestically and to export was made of hydro plants, from hydro plants. Brazil export electricity to Paraguay mainly. I think some for Bolivia now. Minerals, petroleum, gold, silver, phosphate, zirconium, cassiterite that makes tin, graphite, chrome, manganese, bauxite, iron, and uranium. Diamonds in terms of stones, tourmalines, aquamarines, topazes, I don't know how you call, amethysts, emeralds, and others, different ones. But this is what I mean with the more we change, the more you continue the same. This is the photo that a journalist took in Rio de Janeiro in 1978. Things changed, but did not change that much. That is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Rocha, for your presentation. Two things I would like to say here. You mentioned the Malays revolt that happened in Bahia, so the former slaves that organized a revolt against the masters. That gave me an idea, actually. Those enslaved people and free people that were expelled from Brazil for organizing the revolt and sent back to Africa, they actually form an Afro-Brazilian diaspora in West Africa. And I may speak about that in one of the sessions here to see how Afro-Brazilian the diaspora and the culture is today in West Africa, okay? So we may be talking about that. I have a question. Perhaps the question is too complex for you to answer in 2 minutes. Perhaps it may render another presentation. But I think a question that is obvious to ask you is, why was Brazil the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery? So that's a question that people always ask, and it would be interesting. You partially answer that as well, but I guess, I don't know if that's a topic for another presentation or if you want to briefly try to answer that, why Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery.
Well, I'm not a specialist in history of slavery, but I think we have to consider certain elements. Brazil is one of the few countries that controls the slave trade in both sides, because people talk a lot about what do they call no, forgot the name. This money to pay back the former enslaved. Forgot.
Reparation, you want to say?
Reparation. About reparation. And I always think about that reparations in Brazil would be complicated because Brazilians actively worked in the slave trade, and not only because Portugal owned ports that traded slaves, they owned the port, They owned the ships, but Brazilians owned the ships and the ports. There were Brazilians working both sides of the oceans, and not only the Atlantic Ocean, but the Indic Ocean. So there was this group of merchants that owned the ship, that have connections with the ports, or sometimes they had a warehouse in Africa where they buy slaves, and they have the place where they sell. So the flux of people were continuous. There was no problem with that. Okay, so that's one thing. So there was no, and the coast of Brazil is so large and extended. We have more. You spoke in your first talk about Brazil. We have about 8,000 kilometers of coast, and we have so many ways of smuggling people inside Brazil that made complicated. That's why people talk about more than 4 million people imported from Africa, well, forcibly introduced from Africa to Brazil. But this is not exactly, it's difficult to precise because there are lots of smuggling, there are lots of people who died in this transport, there were lots of, you know, hiding the numbers to avoid paying the taxes. So it's complicated. So we have this flux of people, influx of people from Africa all the time. Also, that's one of the things that even with all the rebellions and the wars that Brazil had, somehow the elite managed to keep themselves together, to keep the order, to control the people. One thing that it talks a lot is the idea of this in between, because the people can be co-opted, people can be brought to their side. So you have lots of mulattoes working with the slave trade. You have lots of mulatto people and even black people who would be in position of management, enslaved black people in position of management, which would control enslaved population. And that also made it easy to control rebellions inside. And the society itself, because even after the abolition, the society did not accept the status of black people. So one of the last thing about slavery in Brazil was the law that gave labor rights to domestic workers, which was signed in 2012 and created a furor in Brazil because people did not want to give labor rights to domestic workers, and many people compare the situation of domestic workers as in slavery because they didn't have a limitation for hours, they have the rights, but nobody respected the rights of vacation or free time. They were expected to work sometimes 12 hours a day, sometimes more. So this society and the structure, the political structure, I think, got together in a way to keep slavery such a long time.
Yes, okay, thank you. That explains a lot, yeah. So I now open the floor to our audience. Does anyone have a comment about this presentation or any question? So feel free to ask.
Marcos,
Yes, Marcia, go
I
ahead.
I have a question. I heard you mention that we some of the slaves went back to Africa or something like that. Is it this why there is some part of Africa that people speaks Portuguese?
No, no. Uh, there are 5 countries in Africa that speak Portuguese, but the reason is because the Portuguese were colonizers there like they were in Brazil. So the majority that went back to Africa and formed a diaspora today, they are in countries where other languages are spoken, but not Portuguese, and they lost completely their Portuguese. There's only a few words left, but they don't speak Portuguese anymore, and they returned exactly after the Malays revolt that Dr. Rocha mentioned in 18. Most of them arrived between 1835 to 1840, majority in 1838.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions, other comments? No? Okay. So if there are no other questions, I thank you very much, Dr. Rocha. So next week, we probably will be talking about culture and food. Okay. So we will talk a bit about Brazilian culinary arts, and you may learn a bit more about what we like to eat and what the typical dishes of some region of Brazil are. Okay. So we'll be back next week to talk about that. Dr. Rocha, you want to say something as to conclude your presentation? Any comments, final comments?
Well, just to say that the people still pushing for change, and we are trying to. So when the elites compromise and accept certain change to keep the structure, the lower class is still fighting. So the situation is, of course, much better. In this 200 years, situation has improved in Brazil. Not there yet, but we're still fighting.
Actually, while you were presenting, that's something I thought as well. So all that struggle that's going on since the 1800s still are present in Brazilian society today, and I guess to a large extent in many other places in the world as well, where the elites try to hold onto power as much as they can. So they do not only have the monetary control of everything, but also the political control of things. And yes, so this is a struggle that is ongoing, especially in Brazil today as well.
All right, so thank you very much.
So thank you very much, everybody. See you next week again, same place, same time, and I say bye-bye to you all.
Bye-bye, and thank you. Obrigada.
Boa noite.
Boa
Obrigada.
noite, boa noite.